Thank you for joining us on the Winning at Selling podcast. I'm Bill Hellkamp of Reach Development Systems, and with me is Professor Scott Plum of the Minnesota Sales Institute.
Some business leaders and financial professionals make decisions based on fear versus opportunity. If these opportunities are ignored, the chance of increased revenue is lost because the focus is on fear. You cannot increase revenue by cutting expenses. Listen up as Bill and I discuss revenue versus expenses on episode 553 of the Winning at Selling podcast.
Well, this should be an interesting conversation, Scott. I know you've talked about you can't increase revenue by cutting expenses, and both of us have some great examples in this area. So
Yeah. There's a little bit of overlap, I think, between the book and the topic. So
absolutely.
Make the connection.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, the book is What Great Salespeople Do. We're on chapter 5 called Story Building. And this is all about kind of a lesson on how to build a story, which I think is very good if you're not really used to using stories. As I've been thinking about this more and watching myself in client interviews, I really do use stories a lot, but I can always improve it. And what he talked about, I thought his opening was that change is at the heart of story. And I think that's so important. What the stories do for him and what he's saying the stories do for the customer is they help them overcome the resistance to change. And when we're trying to convince somebody to do something, they have a fear of doing it. And he uses a great example about people getting into lifeboats.
Yeah.
And he said that you would think that when the lifeboat gong goes off on a ship sinking, people would run to the lifeboat and get in it as quickly as they can. But he said most people tend to hesitate and wait because they're used to being on the ship and they can't really believe the ship is going to sink underneath them. And until the last minute, they think something's going to happen to fix it. And the lifeboat is the change. It's unknown. And so they don't want to get into the lifeboat because it's the unknown. So I don't know if I would do that or not, but his point is we need to help them get over that change. And that's the story structure.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point and a great question to ask is you're not sure if you would do the same thing. Well, I think that question can be applied to us every single day in a normal day is what decisions are we making based on fear? What decisions are we making based on opportunities? And what's holding us back on making a change? Because I think change begins with awareness, but I also believe that self-awareness is the beginning of growth. And when we concentrate on self-awareness, we're looking at what we have and what we don't have, and we're filling in that gap and hopefully building up our skills and our talents and our experience. And with that change, when it's applied, we get a better outcome. We get a better life.
Yeah. Well, point well taken, but I think that's getting us off the target.
Yeah.
That's more into the personal development, which I think is important. But what we're talking about here is how do we help someone else overcome this fear of change? And he talks about the story. Now, let's go ahead and go into the basics of the story structure. He's got 5 things that you need to put together to have a story. One is you want to start with the point. What is it I'm trying to get across here? And I think that is invaluable information. In my presentations training, we use a lot of stories. We help people use stories. And the first thing we always start off is what do you want them to think about? What do you want them to do differently? What's the point you're trying to make? Because at the end of the story, I'm going to have them say something like, the reason I tell you that story, or what I want you to get from that, or the point I'm trying to make from that is, and then you tell them real overtly what that point is. So he talks about the book Start with the Why. If you've read Simon Sinek, which is a good, valuable book. But really, you need to know what is the change, what is the reason that I'm going to tell this story. And then once you have that, I think it's easier to find a story. Whereas I think people hope that they can create a story, but not really know the point they're trying to make from it.
Right. I think there's a couple of points within the point. Is that everything starts with our emotional brain and goes to our thinking brain. And that's why I think the authors are really making the point of story selling or storytelling and is really the process of how people go through change and overcome fear. And I love this part of the book is that the bottom line is if you don't have a point, you don't have a story. And, you've heard many people say, what's the point? And then whoever's telling the story has to get to the point because they didn't make it clear when they were presenting the story.
Like, well, you don't necessarily have to make the point early. You don't have to preface it with the point.
True.
But you're right. This thing can go on forever. And then people are going, so great story. What does that mean? Especially in a business setting, whether it's a presentation or whether you're trying to convince a client. You're absolutely right. People are saying in the back of their head, okay, I kind of like this story, but why are they telling me this story? And you have to have a point from it. I talk about this in presentations. You can tell a joke. There's nothing wrong with telling a joke in a business presentation, kind of a story, but you better have a point to it. It better relate. You're there to infotain them. You're entertaining them with the story. You're connecting them with the stories they've talked about. But then you also have to make a point that says, here's what this all means. Here's why I took those 2 minutes to tell you that.
Yeah, I think some of the illustrations in this chapter, they talk about an arc, and the point is separate from the process. So the other 4 steps are all part of an arc.
Go ahead with
those. The point is to be able to make it. So the first, we have the point, which is separate, and everything has to start.
That's the overarching thing that we're trying to get to.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
And then there's the other 4 steps is the setting, the complication, the turning point, and the resolution. I mean, that's slowly increasing. So you start with the setting, then you go up to the right to the complications, then you go up to the right to the turning point, and then you go down to the right on the resolution as to what was the outcome of it. What was
the turning point is the peak of the arc, right?
Yeah.
And then the resolution is kind of at the end. Yeah, I found as I've been teaching people to tell stories in my presentation course, they really think we need too much information on the setting. They go into the setting too deeply. Okay, here's what you need to know. You need to know it was August, and you need to know this, and you need to know that, and all those things should be revealed in the story. So I found the setting should be very quick. A couple of months ago, I was driving down the highway. Boom. A couple of months ago, I was driving down the highway in my sports car that I usually store. And now I've gotten you a visual picture of kind of where we are, what's going on. But I think a lot of people will spend way too much time in the setting and never get to the complication or the problem. And so that's something to be careful of. They don't need to know, what color the trees were and how old you were at the time. I mean, any points that are valuable, a lot of those can come out later in the story.
And that part of the setting, and I think this is important when you do the setting. I mean, when you say you're driving down the road, I'm wondering, is it daytime or nighttime?
It may not be valuable to the story, though.
Right, exactly the point is the setting is the opportunity to just share what's relevant to the story and the point. And for salespeople, I want to apply this to salespeople, is when you're talking with a prospect and you're doing a proposal, only include what you've talked about in the proposal or the quote. Don't include anything else, because when you start including other stuff that's not part of the story, it's not relevant and it's a distraction, and it causes people to get lost during the story.
Well, I think, but I think the story is not really always during the proposal stage. I think this is earlier in the process. It could be during the proposal stage.
The setting is what's relevant. So only share what's relevant to the story. Don't share stuff that's not relevant.
Right.
So just like a proposal. But
I think also you don't need to describe everything about the setting in the first setting. A lot of these pieces can come up as you tell the story, as you go into the complication. So in my story of driving my sports car along the road, the complication can come in the middle where I was stopped by the police, and I could say, and he says, your tabs are out of date. And I think to myself, oh, I bet they're out of date because I didn't, I store this all the time, and I stored it for a few years, and then I never got the tab information again. And so if I don't use it for a couple of years, they quit sending you the tab information. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, these things are 4 or 5 years out of date. Right. So the complication can come in. Whereas if I told all those things early in the story, thinking they're part of the setting, I screw up my own story. I screw up the interest factor later on because I put too much stuff in the setting. So the really important part is the complication, the problem. What's the issue that's coming up? And then I thought it was really interesting is that people it's hard for them to identify the turning point. What is
Yeah,
the idea or the concept or the change that had to be made? So in my story, the officer said, you need to go get your tabs renewed. And I knew I was going to have to go to the DMV, which is always a challenge, right? So that's kind of the turning point. And then there's more turning point that happens later. But it's interesting. So, but you really do have to set up this complication. And here's what I found. I think people try to find a story that's exactly the same as the one that they're telling. So if I'm working with a widget manufacturer, I have to find a story about another widget manufacturer. And that's not the thing you're looking for. You're looking for a similar type of complication. The complication might be, I couldn't get the product I needed in time. And so it doesn't matter if it's a widget manufacturer you're talking about or a thumb screw manufacturer you're talking about. It's the problem itself that they relate to. And sometimes if you use a story that's about the same kind of manufacturer, it's too close to call. It might be their biggest competitor, and they don't want to know that you're working with their biggest competitor.
Right.
Well, that might not be the thing you want to talk about, but it's a similar complication and a similar turning point resolution. How you help them solve the problem is the key. How your product or service solve the problem for them to get them over this complication.
Yeah. Very important step. And this is out of the book, is without a struggle, there is no plot. Without a plot, there is no story.
That's right. That's right.
And you look at it going, and this is why metaphors are so influential when it comes to sales and talking with prospects, is you're using metaphors, which are similar situations that somebody can relate to, and they can see the process and they can go through a decision-making process based on a metaphor, and they can end up applying that same formula to the current decision that they have to make to get hopefully the best outcome possible, whatever that is, which is still yet to be determined.
That's right.
And they talk about the vulnerability within the complication, and the storyteller is, and it's out of the book, when you reveal your shame, your listener will connect to your human imperfection. And I just love this when it comes to human interaction is empathy and vulnerability and a sense of connectedness with two people that hopefully are working together on the same side of a table against a goal or a problem. And now you've got that complication, you've got that metaphor, you've got that connection, and then you end up going to the turning point, which is the next part of the story.
Right. Well, that's and we're gonna truncate it there because that's what you talked about. The turning point is important, and that whole resolution, and the resolution is obviously how your product or service helped them solve that complication, right? And so the next part is they go into a card system. They really kind of repeat what they do, but they use colored cards so they can visually see where they are in the story. You get the book if you want to know more details on that. We're not going to try and teach you. This would be, for me, this would be a 2-hour teaching system. So, so we're not going to try and teach you that. But I did think the last part he talked about was important in our last couple of minutes. He talked about the language of emotion, and that we tend to not use very vibrant language. We tend to use very flat language. And he gave a list of about 50 emotional words, and I think he said there were 900 emotional words that we can use. And so for each of the turning point, each of the pieces, the setting, the turning point, the complication, the resolution, he attached a vibrant word to that. And I thought that was a good way to help us understand how we can add a little bit more vibrancy in our language, because the language connects to the emotions.
Right. Yeah. There's the great story in the book about the conversation between truth and story. And, the difference between the two in the effectiveness is adding emotion to that. And once you add emotion to it, then there's a sense of connectedness.
And that's what we're trying to do with the stories, right? We're trying to go from just the logical side to the emotional side. So don't use a whole bunch of logical language. Use more emotional language. And I think that's good. So next week we'll have no book club because we are going to have a guest. He's a marketing expert, Corky Hall. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have with him.
I think we're going to hear some great stories from him. So thanks for lining that up. As we said in the opening, we're going to cover revenue versus expenses today. And this topic came out of a situation that I was in recently on facilitating a company leadership meeting about increasing revenue. And I found the director of sales really focusing on creating opportunities and leveraging those opportunities to income. And the CFO was concentrating on cutting expenses and reducing investments. And I just see this tremendously, I don't know, is it cognitive dissonance or internal struggle within a company? And I believe that sales is the engine that pulls the train. Nothing happens without a sales team, a salesperson, or really developing the sales channel. So how can companies generate more revenue is the real question that we need to live every single day. And more money can solve a lot of problems within companies. And it's really surprising how we get really confused with cutting expenses, thinking that it's going to increase top line revenue. Have you ever been in that situation, Bill?
Well, yeah, I've been in that situation recently where a CFO is trying to cut expenses, and I think what they don't believe is I don't think they intrinsically believe that sales is a creative event. I think they believe that sales happens by accident, and all the other things we do, our good service, our good work, our good product, our marketing, those are the things that make sales happen, and salespeople just stumble into those blindly with and truth be told, Scott, some salespeople do. They sit around waiting for the phone to ring, and when they do, they answer it competently and deal with it competently, and they don't get into the creative part of selling. And if you don't get into the creative part of selling, creating things from whole cloth, making phone calls, talking to people, and getting those, and you just wait for the marketing calls to come in or the referrals to come in, then you are exactly doing what the CFO expects, and that is you're just an answerer. So you've got to get into the creative things, but those creative things cost money, which means you have to devote training to good salespeople on understanding how to do that. They have to have the time and the capacity to sit down for a couple hours a day and make phone calls. And that is an expensive part of what they do. They can't be customer service people all the time.
Wow. Yeah. You're talking about a blended role. And there's a lot of salespeople that are listening and a lot of sales directors and company leadership that are listening. And I think they battle or deal with that all the time. Is it broken it up into sales department and the customer service department? Or is it this person went out and found the sale, built the relationship, sold the products, worked on implementing the products or services, and now they're in charge of servicing it? Well, guess what's going to happen to that salesperson is their sales skills are going to be dulled. They're not going to know how to start a conversation with somebody that they don't know, but they certainly know how to please everybody when it comes to the application of the product or service, and they maintain the relationship. And in some cases, they end up working more for the customer than the client, their own employer, and they end up being overly empathetic to the customer, and then they end up working against their own employer on cutting the price or increasing services or throwing stuff in. And now, wait a minute, who are you working for?
Yeah.
I mean, you're supposed to be working for us, building up the revenue from that channel, and now you end up cutting the price and thinking that what are we going to do? Make it up in quantity? We can't do that. So it's really important to identify the role and the boundaries, and what are you going to measure, and how are you going to lead a sales team to work on client acquisition and maintain a customer service team on client retention? Completely different skill sets.
Well, and I think that, really I was working with a client recently, and what they said was, okay, we want to take these people who are our best client service people, or our people that have the most potential to be salespeople. We've been a client service company. We need to be more sales focused because we have some real big goals. And so we're going to move them over to sales, but we want them to do still about 25% service and 75% sales. And I thought that might be a problem. I talked to a friend of mine who also came from the sales business. He said they're going to go 80%, 90% customer service, and sales will continue to be a happenstance. And I said, well, I don't think so. I think they're pretty committed. Well, now we come to the other side of the problem, and the company doesn't want to or can't afford to hire the customer service people to replace the ones they took out to make salespeople. And now we're having a lot of problem because the salespeople don't have time to do the sales things they need to do. So we are pulling them back in. They want to be back in customer service because it's more familiar to them. And then the company isn't giving them the resources, and they're pulling even harder back into customer service. And it's just crazy because, again, when we do that, we say the tools, the things you need to do, the activities you need to do for sales, they really don't matter.
Right.
Only thing that matters is customer service.
Right. Retention.
Yep.
Which is important, but you also need to be bringing in new clients and new customers all the time, because there are companies that go away that you've been working with. And
as hard as you work on retention, you're going to still lose some. Somebody's going to come in and promise them a better price, even if they're lying. They're going to promise
merge.
Yeah, that's right.
And all of a sudden, a decision was made, and they decided to go in a different direction. I mean, geez, if you were offering payroll services to restaurants during COVID, guess what? If that's all you did, you were in trouble.
Right.
So there just wasn't any payroll to be done.
That's
but
right.
Think about, here's the question I think that is really important. If you're ever stuck in a dilemma between revenue or expenses, and here's the question: what it is or what it will be. And what it will be is seeing the potential in something and not living in a state of fear, and being optimistic and having an outlook of possibilities as to what it will be. And then look for the evidence. Where's the evidence to support that? And if you can build something, look at it, here's what it is, but here's what it will be, and here's the evidence to support that position. Now you've got a foundation of making a sound investment, an investment of money and time and talent and resources. This is the salespeople going out and starting new conversations by getting new customers into the business so that the business will grow. This top line revenue. Now, we can cut expenses and increase profit, but cutting expenses will not increase top line revenue. More money can make it a lot easier for a company to work more effectively within the service and the products, and efficiently within the process and the expenses to increase profitability. But you need all of the areas in order to increase profitability. And I think every business leader wants to increase profitability. And there's different times and different ways of doing that in the lifestyle and the life cycle of a business. So if we think about,
so here's a question. Hold on. Yeah, here's a question comes to mind for me. This is great advice for the CFO.
Yeah.
But the CFO isn't listening to our podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
True.
So who's listening to our podcast is the salespeople and the sales leadership.
Right.
So what can you do? What can we say? What can we give them to help them when the CFO says we need to cut expenses, and sales training or commissions or
advertising,
marketing, that's got to go because, well, it's not really that important because sales just happen by accident anyway. So what can we give them? How can we help them understand what the value of all these things is?
I would turn the tables on them and say, could you help me kind of paint a picture as to how you see this working over the next year? And get an idea on what their vision is, which is what it will be. Tell me what it will be when we start cutting expenses. How do you see that impacting the company, and where will that put us in a year from now? Mm-hmm. So get their information, and this is, Covey, seek to understand before being understood. I think that's the way it is, the way it goes, and to be able to find out where their vision is. And then once you get that information, then you have a format that you can sell to or persuade or influence somebody to look at it differently, and to really look at providing evidence that is either going to support or dismantle that plan over the course of a year. And there's a lot of things that go into running a business that not everybody is really aware of. And I read this out of a book, Fierce Conversations. And it's like looking at a beach ball, a striped beach ball, is everybody's just concerned about their stripe on the beach ball. But everybody makes up the beach ball, and you have to think about the beach ball before you can just think about the stripe in the department that you're in too. And sometimes that's where things get broken down. But
well, I think understanding too. I think understanding and starting to keep records is important, because you have to have some proof for this. You talked about, do we cut advertising and marketing? Well, as a sales leader, do you have any kind of evidence about what the number of sales you're getting from marketing is? Do you know where your sales are coming from? if all your sales are coming from marketing, well, number one, you ought to teach your salespeople to go out and find some sales on their own. But number two, you better defend your marketing department, because right now that's where a lot of your sales are coming from. Can you get help from whoever's doing your sales training that shows that they can shorten the sales cycle, that they can close better, they can have a higher closing percentage because you're training the salespeople on a regular basis. Are you, as a sales leader, doing anything to train your salespeople on? Oh, they're too busy. I can't. We learned this from the guys who did sales jujitsu. If you don't have an hour sales meeting every month to train them how to do better, they're going to forget everything and go back to their old habits. So what are you doing to make the sales training that you took do something? You and I have experienced this, Scott. We can train people on something, but we can't make them do it. And it's those next 2 months after the training. Are you talking about it all the time, or you let them go back to what they always did? Are you letting them go back to servicing their customer instead of out there selling? Even this is something I learned a long time ago. It's better to make 5 calls a day and actually make them than to hope to make 50 calls a day and do nothing.
Yes, exactly.
And keep jocking them up. And then on Friday, I'm going to make 50 calls, and you still don't make 50 calls. Just do 3 or 4 or 5, get something moving that gets you in the habit. But they just don't have good habits. You're trying to change habits, and the companies, when they cut costs, like my client did, they're pulling them back into customer service and making them not have the time to make new phone calls, thus proving that sales doesn't work.
Right. Like I worked with one company, and they took the salespeople off the floor and put them in the warehouse driving a forklift to help get orders out the door. And wait a minute. These salespeople are salespeople. They bring the sales in, the customers in. And by the way, they're not trained on how to run a forklift.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. I don't want to get into that too deep, because I think that's going to be another topic that I don't want. But you're absolutely right. When they do that, they say sales doesn't work. Every time you take a salesperson out of what they're supposed to be doing, you're saying they don't do anything. So it doesn't matter if they're driving a forklift or if they're pretending to sell, because they really don't sell anything. It just happens through whether it's marketing or a great service or whatever. So every time you do that, you're saying sales doesn't matter, because you guys you salespeople really don't do anything. That's cross train. Cross training. Yeah, that's to cut expenses so that we can get a more versatile team, and that we don't have to spend as much money hiring labor. Oh, okay. How's that going to work? I mean, are we scaling or not? Take your $100,000 a year salesperson and put them into the warehouse. Yeah, perfect. $15 an hour job. That's right. Perfect. That's good thinking. Anyway. Good thinking. A couple of things just when it comes to how do you increase sales, how do you increase revenue for a company? And, I'm just going to go through them kind of quickly, but, increase the quantity of your sale. You sell more. If you sold 100 one month, sell 150 the next month. Okay, that's one way of doing it, but what's going to change and how is that going to happen? And where's the evidence to support that change? Increase the frequency. So if somebody orders every 6 weeks, if you can increase the frequency and have them order every month, that can, increase more revenue. You could just increase the price. That can be sometimes the easiest. We saw that a lot over the last year and a half. Well, everybody's believing the prices are going up, so they're raising them. Right. Everybody's raising it, whether it's affected or not. I mean, when COVID first hit and I heard food prices were going up, and I said, when I go to Costco, that 1 pound of spinach still costs $4.99. And I haven't seen that go up for the last year. That's what you get for buying spinach. Yeah, well, because nobody wants spinach, Scott. That's why it's cheap. I needed it. Demand is low. Yeah. So increase prices, and people increase prices when they didn't have to increase prices. I mean, it's incredible. Look at the sales cycle and create a path to purchase from small to big, and work within adding up existing tickets. Adding up existing sales within existing customers, and now you're really working on creating advocates for you, because they've bought so many products from you over time that they're a referral source, a recommendation, a testimonial video. Increase the value. So, think about packages, and don't cut
on some areas, that focus on cutting the price, but not necessarily adding more value in it. And we've seen this between Sam's Club and Costco. Costco believes you add more value to justify the purpose. Sam's Club believes if we can cut a nickel off the price, we're going to sell more to our members. But this requires sales training as to how do you sell on value? How do you increase the value in the conversation and then create more perceived value? Again, this focus on supporting training, sales training with your salespeople. How do we train them to be able to increase the perceived value? And then lastly, number 7 is don't cannibalize your own product or price. And I see it too often where salespeople cut their own price and it's not necessary. All right. It's also training and negotiations.
Great advice. I just want to close this section with a reminder to sales leadership. If you don't want your sales team perceived as accidental and more valuable in the warehouse driving a forklift, as Scott said, then don't be accidental.
Yeah.
Prove that you are actually out there making calls, creating sales, creating the business, and not just answering the phone calls that come from marketing. You are the one that makes the decision as to whether your team is valuable or not. And if they don't know how to sell well, if they need more training, you should be with them, training them all the time. You shouldn't be sitting on your computer in your office all the time looking at metrics. You should be doing something to affect those metrics in a positive way.
Yeah. Very good point, Bill. Very good point.
All right. A couple of resources. I don't know if you had anything, Scott. I would suggest, and this goes back to the book and the story selling, my 2-minute selling tips. You can go to any of those 2-minute selling tips, and I believe I start every one of those with a story. So if you want to see an example of how stories are used to make a point, I think I'm pretty good at that. I may not use the same arc exactly, but all of these make a point. And so I think just a good way to go through, and they're about 2 to 3 minutes long, and you'll be able to get a lot of information out of those.
Yep. We'll have that link on the website.
Oh, great. Thanks. I appreciate that. Our golden nugget for today comes from Herman Melville. We cannot live for ourselves alone. Our lives are connected by 1,000 invisible threads, and along these sympathetic fibers, our actions run as causes and return to us as results.
Oh my. There's a lot to get your arms around there.
Well, I was trying to, I was saying again about the book, but also about, revenue versus expenses. Everything we do has a cause and effect, right? And that's what he's talking about, these invisible threads. When we make a decision to do something or to not do something, it affects the people around us. And we don't live in a cocoon. We live with other people. And I think it's important to realize that the things we do, they return to us either as good or bad, depending upon the vibrations that we send out.
Yeah. If I can just tell a brief story. I was on a flight to Laguna Beach a couple of weeks ago, and I'm listening to the flight attendants go through the pre-flight, with all the passengers, and they're talking about if you're sitting in the exit row, and here's what the flight attendant said. If you're sitting in an exit row and you have an unknown condition that will prevent you from performing the task necessary, then please talk to the flight attendant about being reassigned. And I'm thinking, unknown condition? How would I know if I have an unknown condition? But it's like, this is so out of the ordinary from that normal blah, 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 blah at the front of the plane. It's like an unknown condition. What do you mean? Excuse me. How do I know
something I don't know?
Well, yeah. Where am I? I have a right to know where I am. Unknown condition. I just can't get that out of my head. Everything we talked about will be at the website, winningatselling.com. This is episode 553, so you can watch Bill's video there.
No book club next week because we're going to have a guest. The guest is Corky Hall. He's the co-founder of Stellus Consulting, and he's a branding expert. So we're going to talk about how sales can support the brand. Please subscribe, share the podcast with your colleagues on your social media sites, connect with Scott and I on LinkedIn. Go out and get better, one skill at a time.
Joyful selling.